here with Patrick Callahan, who just had on Life on the Rock, talking about the Newman Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
That's right. Thank you very much.
We're excited to hear about what you're doing, and I keep coming back to that. You all are offering accredited courses that the university will accept in great works of literature and Catholic thought. And let's start with that. What are some of the courses that you all offer?
Yeah, so they're modeled in part, and they have this sort of history, a genealogy, as it were, from the Pearson program from the University of Kansas in the 1970s. So a lot of these lists, right? John Sr., who taught in the Pearson program in the 1970s, was friends with Mortimer Adler from the Chicago School. I went to the University of Dallas. A lot of these things are, great book lists. They're not necessarily as important as people suppose them to be. John Sr. wrote in The Death of Christian Culture that when he was a young undergraduate, he was really concerned about the exact list of great books he had to read.
Right.
And Mark Van Doren, great professor at Columbia, looks at him and just looks up on his shelf and just randomly grabs it. He's like, this is Plato. Here, start with this. Mm-hmm. So there's a busyness that we can have of just trying to check them all off. Mm-hmm. But we do, you have to eventually draw a line and figure out this is the program of what we're doing. So right now we have a catalog of 5 classes. There are 3 credit hour courses that transfer in for our students. Then they can apply them to some of the goals that they have to graduate from the University of Nebraska. Mm-hmm. So we have one called Pilgrims, Seekers, and Sojourners, right, which is a class which focuses really on literature of pilgrimage and experience, reading things like the Odyssey and Chaucer and Don Quixote. We have another class called Love and Friendship, which is, again, starting with where college students are, right? Because where is their mind right now, right, is on these sorts of things, defining these kinds of relationships, right? Eventually they will probably realize, like many of us do as you get older, that, family is a big part, right? Mm-hmm. But love and friendship, right? So start with that and then invite them into the deeper meanings of that, right? Because obviously, right, the greatest love we see on the cross and the highest friendship is the one that, we find in Christ, the gospel that we find in John, right? The discourse on friendship. Mm-hmm. I think that's something that's missing often in Catholic discourse today about the way that we train people. I think that there's a wonderful book called The Friendship of Christ by Robert Hugh Benson, where he talks about this as sort of the last of the sort of things that Christ is training us for. One of the things I find sort of lacking in a lot of our Catholic programming is we have a heavy emphasis on discipleship and mission and apostolate, but we're kind of missing that last step that Christ is calling us to. And you find in the Catholic tradition of deep friendship and what that means to be friends with God.
Right.
Because it's we call it friendship, but it's a completely different concept of friendship, and it's so hard to grasp. But you find it again in the Gospels, right? It's what Jesus is asking us to come to.
I no longer call you servants,
I no longer call you servants. I call you friends. Right? And Aquinas goes on this. It's a really strange thing for God to call you friend.
Yeah.
Right. It makes sense. God will call you a disciple. Disciple is the Latin word for a discipline, a rule, right? You're following a structure. We're obeying orders, right? And that's right. We need to be reordered because of original sin. We need to rightly order ourselves. That missionary response, fantastic.
Right.
But when we are in the beatific vision, right? Those things are foundational. But that friendship in Christ, that's eternity.
Well, yeah, I remember Pope Benedict talking about it. I forgot if it was in his encyclical God is Love, but he was speaking eloquently about it. And I remember it kind of struck me because I didn't think about the terminology as much friends. And at first it kind of sounds superficial, like, okay, I got friends.
But it sounds really funny. Like, oh, Jesus is my friend, right?
But we're supposed to have, the Protestants are telling us, relationship with Christ. And it is about union. It's a love of friendship that affects and produces this union with Christ, like John of the Cross talks about union.
And there can only ever be friendship between equals. And so what has to happen to us in order for God to be able to
Right.
call us friend.
Right. And that, I guess it struck me too, when you start trying to be friends with Christ, try to have a conversation with him, have a real prayer life, you realize, hey, this is really deep. It's no longer, just not slaves in a workhouse and just, okay, I'm doing my evangelization or whatever, hammering out my prayers or something. But it's like, he's calling me to have a real relationship, conversation, no mutual knowledge and sharing,
Yeah, and again, mutual knowledge, right?
Mhm.
Which is, of course, what happens when we have friends. And of course, our friend is, God, who is spirit, and we have to know him as he is.
Right.
So, we who are this weird amalgam of body and spirit
Yeah.
have to start paying attention to that other side of ourselves and trying to come to know him.
Right. Right. So that's one of your classes.
Yeah, love and friendship, pilgrims, seekers, sojourners.
Yeah.
We have another class on the mystery of evil.
Mm.
Again, all these classes, so we have 5 of them. They're all various great books classes. And, it goes through the whole catalog, right? You have, basically from the beginning of the Greek tradition with Homer and the Odyssey and the Iliad in different classes, all the way up to, 19th and 20th century and even some 21st century works that I think are all speaking to a great tradition, right? Something that's an ongoing conversation that we're having.
What would
So,
be a 21st century work? Can you think of off the top?
oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot here, trying to think of
I
something
think like Story of a Soul.
So I like, yeah, oh, sorry, 21st century work though.
Yeah.
So I really like some modern authors
Oh.
that have been doing some good things, like Mark Halperin.
Okay.
So he's late 20th, early 21st century. So
Okay.
he's got a great collection of stories called The Pacific.
Okay.
And there's other ones who I think, again, there's good books and great books, as John Senior used to talk about. And people get really busy about like this exact list of like the 100 greatest books, and I have to read them, right? And that's not really the way to go about it at all. And there's all these good books that are preparatory for you to actually appreciate the greatness of the great books.
Yeah.
So this is part of the work of the Institute too, as I'm coming in as director, is what we're going to start doing is some teacher training for teachers in our diocese and other dioceses, where we'll be inviting them in to teach them about, the sort of educational experience that we're offering at the Newman Institute, but also what's foundational to that, right? So the good book lists of, with children, like offering them something that fits the needs they have today in terms of training, but also, gives them this imaginative experience that supplies them, that is a substitute, right, for life's hard knocks. The poet A.E. Housman talked about this in a great poem called Terence, This Is Stupid Stuff, where he talks about how poetry and literature are a way of creating enough of an immunity to the poisons of the world, so that when you finally get a dose of it, right, it's not going to knock you off completely off guard.
Right.
Or it's what people love to popularly talk about with G.K. Chesterton, right?
Yeah.
The point is, with children's fairy tales and stories about dragons, it's not that dragons exist. We know that dragons exist, evils exist. It's that dragons can be beaten. And that's something that we have to teach our children.
Yeah.
So,
Or just like all the stories in the Bible of war and sex and everything, that how messed up things can get. It's like, okay, these are things of life. They happen in life. And,
yeah, some real Old Testament mess, right? Going
Unbelievable.
through like with some of the things that the later kings got up to. And looking at someone like David or Solomon. I mean, David, who wrote such beautiful poetry, but so conflicted, so many mistakes. And how do we integrate that life of the person again?
Right. And the story can strike the heart in a way, just that idea of a story. People love, like in preachers, when they tell a story, and it is effective at communicating and reaching the heart, I think.
Yeah, I think that's another one of our classes is the storyteller, and it is sort of what we're trying to communicate is, again, basic foundations in relationships, understanding, what heroism is, understanding how we tell each other stories, and then understanding that we're all on an ultimate path to God, right? Mm-hmm. Again, the sequence of our great books is not designed in sort of we don't treat the tradition like a cadaver, right? Where you're just, okay, now we're going to do the Greeks, now we're going to do the Romans, and then the medieval, and then we're going to do the Renaissance. And so what that does is it treats it as disparate parts. And all of our courses are always designed to take, it's more like an opera, right? Where there's leitmotifs that run through all the tradition. And so we'll start with early literature and we'll build up, and I'm teaching a class this fall where we're gonna end up with some Jane Austen, right? So how do you get from Homer to Jane Austen and see that they're talking about the same sort of human experience, wrestling with the same sort of problems?
Right. Yeah, our sisters were commanding me to watch one of the Jane Austen movies. So it's important that you understand this. So I was
it is, and I think there's a lot of exciting literature. I have a few friends who've been working, Michelle Vacris and Cecil Bohannon, who talk about Scottish Enlightenment philosophy and its influence on Jane Austen. And so you can actually look at the terminology that she uses for her characters and their motivation in the text. And she's actually echoing philosophical thought from Hume and Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiment.
Really?
So Sense and Sensibility.
I never would have guessed.
But once you realize that they're a generation before Jane Austen. Her father was a preacher. He was exposed to this Scottish Enlightenment philosophy. And then I think they published a book, and other people have been publishing articles on this. I mean, it's irrefutable that Austen was deeply steeped in this philosophical tradition. But today, how many people in the general public, right? General public, read David Hume's essays?
Right.
Very few.
Right.
However, how many people have read or have experienced the stories of Jane Austen? An enormous amount. You look at something like Sense and Sensibility, and right there, it's an allegory or a tale of what Hume was trying to articulate between the delicacy of passion and the delicacy of taste, right? Where one of the sisters, is given over to music and emotivism, and the other one she's the visual arts. She looks and she observes. So again, even something like that, as simple as, why is one sister play the piano and why does one draw, right? It actually is a philosophical understanding to all of it.
Yeah, I would ask you, our culture today, we're media drenched. We're all about movies and stuff. More people are ingesting movies. Do you see like some great classic themes that can speak to us in valid ways and deep ways in the movies?
I'll put a pin on that. The answer is yes, and I'll come back to it. But I want to also talk about having taught college students now since 2008. I've experienced this. It's not gone unobserved by me. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that reading is also a habit, right? And I also understand that not many people have cultivated that habit.
Right.
But as someone who works in early Greek literature, what I would also say is that we have this weird fascination with literacy in the book. And what we forget is the ultimate end of it, which is communication between persons.
Right.
Now, in a book, it's happening over centuries. But there seems to be this weird shame that people have over listening to audiobooks of there's a great pleasure in that, right? I can never read a book with character voices as well as some of these great actors who do this. And it's all free that you can get from public libraries or things like that. I mean, some of the great delight I have with my children or just when I'm driving. I mean, how do I consume all the literature that I try to read? I don't always have time to read uninterrupted. So, and that sort of is a bridge, I think, between what you're talking about, this phenomenon of the entertainment, and the reading culture and being exposed to these things. And for some reason, people have a sense of or at least in my encounters, have always had this sort of strange sense of shame of like,
Right.
have you read, Dickens, Great Expectations? Well, I listened to the audiobook and I'm like, no, you've read it.
Yeah.
You, that's the
Mhm.
experience. In fact, sometimes, the same way, like you would not say that the experience of sitting down and reading Shakespeare was the same as going and actually watching a play.
Right.
Right. And the things that you notice,
Yeah.
right? Because then there are other people getting into it and
Yeah.
they're reading a line differently than you'd ever read a line.
Right.
And then it becomes, again, a living tradition.
Uh-huh.
So sorry, I wanted to point that out as something that,
Yeah.
but yeah, in movies, I think we also don't understand the medium and what it is, right? It's
Mhm.
largely a visual medium.
Mhm.
And so its ability to tell story is a visually dominated story.
Right.
So, I think there's some great pieces out there. Ones that, even have very few words, like Dunkirk, which is a film that came out,
Right.
well, not that as recently as I seem to remember, but it's COVID
Yeah. Right. Right.
making me think that things are more recent than they are. But I mean, the story with very little dialogue,
Mhm.
right? Or there's another one set in World War One, I believe it was 1917,
Yeah.
where it just follows one man going through the trenches.
Right.
Beautiful film, right?
Yeah.
Visually beautiful. I don't think it ever can communicate the same kind of thing. And this is a debate that's gone on in sort of philosophy and about poetry and the arts for centuries. Is like, what can the visual arts do, and what can poetry do, and what can music do, and what are the aesthetic possibilities and problems of them. And that goes back to the thing that Jane Austen does, right, where she has one character who is the visual artist and the other one who works in music. Right. And I think we often talk about the scripts and the plot of these things. I think those are less important from sort of a classical understanding of Aristotelian playwrights than we ever imagined, right? We've created a whole different art. And I think the experience is kind of like the invention of opera, where Gluck and Galileo's father actually was involved in this too. These Italians are coming together and in the late Renaissance, and they're trying to recover the music and the style of Greek tragedy. And we now know that what they invented, which is what we today call opera, right, was nothing really like the musical dynamic in ancient Greek tragedy. But they created something beautiful and new, and that's fantastic. They were inspired by something old, and they missed the mark, and they landed on something beautiful. And I think modern film is the same way. They keep looking over the shoulder of other art forms that have inspired modern movies. Then you're kind of missing what movies are able to do, and then we're not speaking of them because we're using a terminology which is fitted for one art form and using it for another. It'd be as if I was an airplane pilot or a designer, right? And I'm using a textbook for boats. And it's true. Like there is it's true that airplanes do take some terminology from shipcraft. However, there's some unique things that you need to talk about with airplanes that you never have to talk about with the ship.
Right. Yeah, just the idea of drama, story, like just good versus evil. I mean, it's like our relativism kind of strips it out of our movies now, and even like this obsession with showing deeply flawed heroes that are,
Well, everything is a dark, gritty reboot until we have the dark, gritty reboot of the dark, gritty reboot. Until eventually we end up with the movie, which is just called The Gratuitator, which is just, sex and violence, which is kind of where we're at. But I don't know. It's sorry, I lost the train of thought there.
Oh, just, with the movies and that. Yeah, just I
but I think there's I'll speak to that's what I want to speak to. I think there's a danger though in getting fixated on story Because again, as an academic, what I look at that is, this is talking about critical theory and narrative, right? And so trying to understand the world and all truth as story. So I think the Christian and the Catholic response is a both and, right? A lot of it is, there is system and there's story. And I think there's a marvelous dance between the two of them. What I've seen in a lot of ministry is that people have sort of recovered this idea of story, and then they become, sort of, they oppose it as a way of explaining the faith, as opposed to, say, like manualism in Catholic theology, right, where everything fits into, subsection A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, B, C, D,
Right.
all that, right, where we systematize truth. And I think it's a little bit of both. And I think that an over-obsession with story, what that misses is the fact that there's a unified whole to all of it, which again is part of God's wisdom and the wisdom that he's inviting us to, which again is when you focus on story and it's your story,
Right.
then it becomes your truth. And then that can be dangerous because it leads into a sort of relativism. But then understanding that there's a system and a whole, and then seeing a story to the whole, right? So the two of them become sort of one.
Yeah, so the weakness of modern storytelling is, seeing that whole, right? The true values behind the whole. Because I marvel at, too, I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and the 70s. When I hit the 80s, I was in high school in the 80s, and it's like, the 70s were horrible. Everything about the 70s is bad. We're much better now. But it was...
well, we keep telling ourselves that.
But one thing I got to say, though, is like, if you look at like television is, there's like fast plots now. There's action. There's real creative storylines, and there's plot. I guess plot, that word, that they could become.
I would agree with you.
Yeah,
I mean,
they become.
For the last 20 years, we really have, like, we when we started cutting out the laugh track.
Yeah. Right.
It actually you got rid of that crutch.
Right.
There have been some good stories that have come out there.
Yeah, and it can be like dazzling, like plot twists and turns and the unexpected and the clever dialogue, and it looks like $1 million, every scene and everything. But yeah, it's like sometimes, though, there's like kind of this emptiness where there's something like an emptiness of the values behind it that doesn't really grab the heart. It's like in the end, it's not memorable. I'm kind of, because now I watch a movie and it's like, I can't tell you what that movie was about. Like, am I getting old, or is it just this action movie that just went so much action? I'm thinking like maybe even like the Star Trek reboots, which a couple of them I thought were just like fantastic. They were a blast to watch. I couldn't tell you anything about them later. It's like there's nothing that spoke to the heart, that maybe hit upon a real heart theme or something that I think like classic works of art do. They've stood the test of time.
But again, that goes back to the recovery of a lost tradition, right? You look at Shakespeare's plays, so many of them are just him cribbing notes off of, other great works, right? The Roman plays, looking at Plutarch, the Spanish tragedy, or any of these other things. Romeo and Juliet itself inspired by another work. So it is, one often doesn't think of Shakespeare as a dark, gritty reboot. Right. It's not that dark and gritty, but it is sort of a reboot. But he puts a new way, a new fashion on it. Even Homer himself. I mean, Homer constantly has to go back in the Iliad to clean up moments where people, they know this tale. It's been told from so many different perspectives, from so many different wandering bards, that when Homer tries to synthesize it into his story, he has to have a number of moments where they're like, people are waiting for a reference to this character or that other episode, and it's not part of his central story. And he has to kind of throw in Easter eggs. So in like book 3 of the Iliad, Helena Troy's looking out over the assembled troops, and she's looking for her brothers Castor and Pollux, right? And everyone in the audience in Homer's day would have known the story of Castor and Pollux and everything else. And so Homer himself is still stuck with this problem of people asking for that. But I think the difference is that he acknowledges that past and works with it and creates something new. I think the problem today with some of our storytelling, what you're getting to the heart of, is the fact that, in our aversion to avoid being derivative, we become hyper derivative to the point where we've stripped out all granularity of characters and plot. I have a friend who talks about with the Star Wars movies, right? Where, the original trilogy, you have like actual family drama, which is heavily reliant. And we don't have to get into Joseph Campbell because I don't particularly adhere to that whole theory. But this whole idea of like going to Oedipus and family relations and like, I am your father, right? These sort of revelations. You look at the new ones and it's just like, hey, you're this random character. Let's go do this random thing. And we're going to blow up this thing and it's going to cost a lot of money. And it doesn't really amount to much, right? Because next thing you know, we're going to just spike the ball on everything when we show the next film. And so what it ends up becoming is sort of the madness of the pre-Christian conception of the world as an infinite loop, right? No beginning, no end. We're just coming in at random points. This is the important distinction between Aquinas and, say, Aristotle, right? Is that Aquinas is like there is a beginning and there's an end. There is a telos to the whole, and there are principles behind it. And understanding the principles and understanding the end is going to lead us to wisdom. And so telling stories that situate people in that larger story, that's going to invite them to wisdom, going to invite them to wonder, to look at their own experience. But I think there's always a danger, though, when we focus on, tell me your story, right? Well, then we're doing the thing which is dangerous, because your story is never just about you, right? We're kind of a nexus of relationships that build the person, right? You're a father, you're a brother, you're a son, you're a sibling, a friend, a priest. Right? All these things are part of who you are, and none of them can ever really be untangled. To remove any of them, to sort of isolate it, right? To say this is who this person is, just as a brother, right? Then you lose the person. Yeah. You've torn apart the watch to figure out how it works, and it no longer is a watch. It's just a bunch of pieces of metal.
Right. I remember my father would read to us a lot growing up, and he had like a child's version of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I remember as a kid just riveted by like some of these characters, like Achilles and Hector and his virtue and war and battle, and some not wanting to fight, and all this kind of tension, and gods being involved and dragging people by the helmet, all this stuff. But I remember just like as a kid, it's kind of, I think back on it, it's kind of amazing how that such an ancient story would just grab a young person's mind.
It does, and in a way that I don't think, to be polemical, I don't think some of our superhero narratives really get to that. Right. There's something missing there. Anyway, yeah.
Maybe you're a classicist. You've studied classical works, and I remember I went on a Footprints of St. Paul's pilgrimage a few years ago, and we went to Athens. I went to the Areopagus, and we went up to the Parthenon, and I remember coming around the corner and seeing it and just saying, I remember, even though it's like blown to smithereens,
and there's pieces missing in the British Museum and other parts.
But there was still something special about it. And then later that night, went down to this fantastic modern museum, the modern design that it's just gorgeous, just the drama of the whole thing, the Acropolis and that. And I was watching this film on the Parthenon, and they talked about it's alive, that it's like it springs to life. And they talked about all all the things they did in building it, designing it, the curves of everything.
Yeah.
And I remember I said, yeah, because I mean, on the trip, we saw all kinds of like Parthenon type temples, but none of them like popped like that one that seemed alive. And it just got me thinking about, this is like 500 BC. The Renaissance is like rebirthing this stuff 2,000 years later, right?
Yeah. Yeah, approximately, yeah.
Yeah. And it's like these Greeks were doing realistic statuary and stuff and a long time before these Italians. I mean, like Michelangelo, and it's like, what is it about the Greek culture that was so fertile, you think?
There's I'm actually have an article that I'm finishing writing this month on the French philosopher Simone Weil. She has a short book called The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. And she talks about this and its understanding in relationship to Christianity as sort of, from the Catholic perspective, the lost heritage that leads to the New Testament. There are things that, Jesus as a Galilean, right, interacting with all these, apostles who have both Hebrew and Greek names, that this larger heritage of Hellenism is part of this. You look at moments of mercy in the Iliad or something like that as something that, or what she talks about is the ability to empathize with your enemy, right? The meeting at the end of the Iliad of Priam and Achilles in the tent, right? And mourning over the dead. Not quite, I don't necessarily agree that it's exactly a matchup with Christian empathy. I think it's these intimations that they're reaching out for, and it's a people who are ripe for it. I think, again, and it's not just myself privately thinking this. The church has spoken again and again. I mean, we believe in an incarnational God who came into history, and while the Hebrew people are unique people, they're God's chosen people. He also chose a time and a place in order for that message to spread, and the Greeks are a big part of that. And I'm not advocating some sort of like special Greek miracle on the level of Exodus or something like that, but I think it's worth looking at because it's part of understanding Paul or understanding any of this, is that the beauty of what they had prepared them for the paradoxical beauty of the cross, right? Because we talk about this with Christianity, is that again, you think of the idealized male figure in ancient Greek sculpture, right? And compare that with the corpus on any crucifix, or our Franciscan San Damiano, right? To look at that beautiful cross that St. Francis beheld, right? If you showed that to an ancient Greek, if you had a time machine, right, they would think it is just atrocious, right? But there's something there that prepared the mind to see a beauty which is immutable, right? And so there's this paradox of what is physically, what the prophet Isaiah talks about, right? Is just horrible to behold, right? But here is true beauty. Here is true love. Sorry if that went off too far from where we started, but I think that's part of what our tradition is as Catholics. I think we kind of ignore it to our detriment, this heritage. No, not all Catholics, right? I mean, there are wonderful traditions. Again, the church has gone out to different parts of the world, and again, it's part of the work that we talk about in the Second Vatican Council documents of enculturation, right? Of looking to see, okay, well, this is what's true to Christian culture, and these are supplemental accretions, which are helpful in particular cultures and times and places, and what's eternal. Obviously, the Mass is eternal, right? Baptism, right? But the forms they take. But if these are things that are born out of Christian culture, right, Michelangelo or something like that, Raphael, and they're inspired by the Greek heritage and they're inspired by Catholicism, then they've been baptized, and why would we throw that out?
Right.
I mean, this is the sort of silliness of, like, hey, I have these plans for this jet plane. I heard you want to design a jet plane yourself. And you're like, no, I'm good. I don't need anything. They're like, really? These have been designed, by, top tier corps of engineers.
Yeah.
It's been certified by all these different people, and they say it's good. Don't you want to use this design?
Yeah.
No, I need it to be completely mine and wholly authentic to me, myself, as my individual person, which again is this weird, where that goes, sorry to get too academic, but that goes back to sort of a Rousseauian Enlightenment version of authenticity and the authentic self as something that you construct on your own, as opposed to understanding that like who you are is part of a larger human community. This is how Christ is able to redeem us, right, as the whole human race.
Yeah, and like, religion takes such a beating today. I'm spiritual, not religious, but it's like you can see in history how it has united people like into. I think, if you look at the Parthenon, right? It's all about a temple, and there's all these religious figures in it.
Going back even earlier to that, to Akkadian or Sumerian cultures, or even there, religion is this unifying thing.
Right.
You try to explain for the past 6,000 years of human history, someone saying that they're spiritual but not religious. They just look at you like, what are you talking about? It makes no sense.
Yeah, it's like I remember I was in a little pilgrimage to Paris and was given and the tour guide was talking, and he was obviously like a fallen away Catholic, but he loved Notre Dame, and he had this great love and appreciation for it. I remember him saying something like, over 200 years, this was built. It's on the order of that or something. But
we don't have the patience for that these days, though.
Yeah, but if you have like a common motivation, you do. You can keep. It's not just one individual company building a skyscraper. It's like a nation over centuries throwing their best artisans at this. Yeah. And you got something that's going to last.
It's not the same scale, but when I was at the University of Kansas, I used to take students in every August out to Colorado. And as we're driving on I-70 in the middle of nowhere in Kansas, we would stop at Victoria, Kansas. Right. The Cathedral of the Plains. Yeah. And if people should look it up, it's quite beautiful. It's this gorgeous limestone. But the small community in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, every person who was part of that parish, right? Instead of, Father asking for a check and hiring a contractor, every single person in that community at the beginning of the 20th century went on their own and quarried the stone and brought it to the church. Wow. And it's their church.
Wow.
Right. And so, they built it in a matter of decades, not a matter of centuries. And it's not Notre Dame, but it is a living church in a way that Pope Benedict XVI would talk about, the spirit of the liturgy, where these are real stones. They communicate the solidity of God and the realness of it. Yeah. That in a way that, sort of prefab aluminum siding and drywall, right? And
Alpha Church Supply.
And look, and it's not to say the mass is the mass, right?
Yeah.
But again, we're embodied souls, and the architecture and all of this communicates something to the spirit, right? We're not just pure materialists, and we're not angels, right? We're in this funny position where it does matter sometimes. The matter matters in order to communicate the spiritual, especially as a father of young children. And you completely see the difference in reaction of when we're traveling, when we take our kids to Mass, and you go to somewhere where there's an appreciation for that sort of architectural tradition that you talked about, from the Greeks to the Renaissance to today, right? Where my kids will go in there and I don't have to worry about them disrupting Mass, and disruption, it's fine, they're children, right? It happens. But there are some churches where I go in there and it's beautiful because it's so stunningly gorgeous that my kids are just quiet and they just are attentive to it. And there's other churches when we travel where, just be honest with you, that like it's very difficult because it's hard for them to tell the difference between this building and like a school or a hall or anything else. There's, again, the sense of the sacred. It's not just about the bishop coming and consecrating the space, right? That affects it, but that the material itself communicates something.
Yeah. And it struck me recently too. I was traveling. I was at a parish. It was like a modern church. It wasn't particularly beautiful, but it was like it had a huge number of people there, and I offered the mass, and it just, I don't know, it just roused me, got my attention to say, wow, all these people are coming. It was like a regular Sunday mass, and it was like they're coming to mass. We are all together. We're all
Yeah.
like, we break away from our media, our privatized media use, and we're all coming together,
Yeah.
and we believe the same thing. We're worshiping, and so
Again, it acknowledges that we're embodied souls, right? And you have to start with that, right? Again, start with that foundation of building the body, getting the base needs met, right?
mm,
Which then creates a space for the spirit to be lifted up.
yeah,
And that's just, we at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Father Robert Matias really built this beautiful Newman Center for us. And the church has one of the largest stained glass window installations in the last, I think, dozen years or something like that. It's enormous. And the beauty of it is that architecture students from our university, no interest in Catholicism, are going to come. And they do. And there's stories of them coming and studying it and coming here. And then there's conversion stories. We have a beautiful pipe organ, right? And our music students come and they practice here. And then they're in the Catholic space. We've won them over. And it's amazing, places I've gone to like that where the beauty that draws them in is that initial hook, but the faith comes about, right? The sacraments are being practiced here, and grace is communicated, and people convert. I mean, there are just so many beautiful stories like that from my time, and and the great books can do that too, and you can carry them with you. I think, sorry to try to take it back home to the classes we teach. One of the core elements of my classes that's different than most great books is that we memorize a lot of poetry. We begin every class with memorization of poetry, and what that does is it strengthens your heart for moments of just giving you words when nothing else comes to you. So, for example, like it's a beautiful day and you don't know what to say. It's a moment where I'll stop and I'll recite Gerard Manley Hopkins, glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple colors, a brinded cow, and just go on and recite the whole poem. And that's it. That's all I have to say, right? Because I don't have the words to communicate how beautiful the top of this mountain is. I don't have the words to communicate how beautiful this spring day is. But there are other people who have, and I'm going to humble myself to recite their words, which in turn prepares you for the Mass. There's a beautiful story I'll tell from one of my classes where a student was, we also memorized some of the Psalms as well. And a student had his grandfather was passing away, and his favorite Psalm was the 23rd Psalm, and they couldn't find a Bible in the hospital room or anything like that. And the student told me that he had memorized it in class. And so he's still an adolescent, so he's letting the grown-ups do their thing, and they're looking everywhere for a Bible and they can't find one. And then he just starts saying, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And he just goes on and recites the whole of the 23rd Psalm, and it's this beautiful gift that he can give to his grandfather on his last day. And
how much more beautiful when it's recited.
When it's recited, right? Because you've taken it into your heart. As a professor, it was one of the big shifts in my teaching was to say, we need to stop going from just essays all the time, just essays. That sometimes there's a value in memorizing a sonnet of Shakespeare and not writing 5 pages on Shakespeare's sonnet. That the student learns the sonnet in a way that's completely different than if I just give them a prompt, because that's all they've been doing. And to break them out of that mold of just like, all right, here's another essay. I'm going to save it to the last minute. I'm going to drink my Red Bull. I'm going to hand it in. Professor's going to grade it. Professor's going to give it back to me. I'm going to throw it in the trash without ever looking at the marks, right? Now, hopefully my students don't do that, but let's be honest, a lot of classes are like that. And a lot of people use just the essay as a crutch in our teaching. And it's not to say I don't assign essays, but
Right.
the amount of poetry that we do is something that I think is it's just a different way of actually learning this material and entering into it. And it's a way of interpreting it too, because again, like any actor will tell you, when the sort of stereotype of like the screenwriter getting in an argument about the actor, about the way they're reading the lines,
Yeah.
it's about a matter of interpretation.
Right.
And so when you memorize a poem, you're entering into that too. Now, of course, as W.H. Auden said in his poem on William Butler Yeats, right, the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living, right? So the dead man can't tell you, you're reading my words incorrectly. But at the same time, it's an honest attempt to try to understand the mind of another human person, that bridge the gap between oneself and another that seems to be the unbridgeable problem. Look at today's world and the confusion that we have of people not understanding each other because they don't try to do that first step to wisdom that St. Thomas Aquinas talks about, where he says to listen willingly. To listen willingly is the first step towards wisdom. And we hear people, but we're already reciting whatever speech and response we have behind us. When you memorize a poem, there's no speech or response that you can kind of come up with. You're just entering into the words of another person, and you're trying to understand them as best as you can, and it changes you, and you're not the same.
Right. Well, that's a good segue to where can they find out more? Website, information on what you all are doing.
Yeah, so we're the newmaninstitute.com. We'd love to have people participate and support our mission in various ways. As I'm coming in here, this is the first 2 weeks of me being director, and we're starting to open things up again post-COVID. So if people want to continue to support what we do in terms of our classes, we obviously have a donate page, which helps us add more faculty and add more course times and reach more students. But also, we are doing teacher training. So people, if you're in K through 12 education and you're a Catholic and you're interested in that, come to our website in the next couple months, and you're going to see that we're going to start offering that in the summer of 2022. So people can sign up for that, and that'll be free. And then we're going to start offering some more pilgrimage experiences as well. So all TBD, but people can pay attention to that. My wife and I host an Instagram blog on books called The Well-Read Catholic, and there's a Well-Read Catholic podcast as well. And so those are things that it was one of the things I created. I got tired of students asking me for book recommendations all the time. I have ready lists of book recommendations, but I realized that there's just an easy way to tell people what to read or recommendations for reading is for them to just follow along and see what I'm reading.
And some of your seminars you hope to post
Yes, seminars and lectures in the future. So past seminars and lectures, I don't believe we have an archive of them. But future seminars and lectures will be going out in podcast and on YouTube. And they can always find that at newmaninstitute.com.
Yeah, podcasts are great. We spend so much time in the car. It's a great way to get information and stuff. So,
yeah.
Thank you so much, Pat.
No, thank you, Father.